All right, here we're going to look at our notes for section 2.3. So we're going to finish up filling out this foldable thing with our different properties. But first we always start with our learning targets. So remember, we're just finishing up this learning target here today, as I can solve inequalities using multiplication and division. So back on this page, we're going to go through and kind of figure out our multiplication and division properties of inequality, and then see what happens. What about when I have a negative number? What's going on there? So my multiplication property is really similar back again to that multiplication property of equality that we talked about before. Is when I multiply by the same, so multiplying both sides by the same number gives same inequality. Ooh, it's hard to type and write, or write and talk at the same time. So here I just know that my multiplication property of inequality tells me that if I multiply both sides by the same thing, I end up with the same inequality. So that's one really good way to get rid of some things. So here we have our example. We're going to have x divided by 8 is greater than negative 5. Okay, so I see that I'm dividing this inequality. Okay, so I know to undo that division, I go ahead and I multiply. So I multiply both sides by that 8. And remember, I always have to multiply by whatever's in the denominator. So what's left over here is x. My symbol stays this way. Negative times a positive gives me a negative. 5 times 8 is 40. So then I can also go ahead and graph that on my number line, right? And I'm in the right order. I've got my variable, my symbol, and then my constant. So let's go ahead and do a quick little graph of that. Okay. Whoop, and that's a negative 40. So since we're in this order, my variable, and then my symbol, then my constant, I know I can use this to help me determine which direction I shade. So I see that it's not equal to, so it's going to be an open circle on that negative 40 and shaded to the right. Okay, so we've gone ahead and solved that one. So now our division property tells me that dividing both sides by the same thing gives us the same inequality. So just like everything, all these other properties I'm undoing, but I have to do it to the both sides. So here, if I divide both sides by the same number, we end up with the same thing. So here we're going to look at a negative 24 is greater than or equal to 3x. So I see, since I'm multiplying, and I know that I'm multiplying because there's no symbols, to undo that I divide. So I'm going to divide this side by 3 and divide this side by 3. So what's left on my right side is x. My symbol stays the same direction. 24 divided by 3 is 8, and a negative divided by positive is a negative. Well, I always want this to be written as, right, our variable and then our symbol and then our constant. So let's go ahead and rewrite this. So if I start with my variable, I see it was towards the point, so it's still towards the point, and negative 8. Now I can use this to help me kind of graph my final answer. So let's go ahead and draw our little number line. So since I have this equal to part here, I know that that's going to be a closed circle, and I'm now shading to the left. So it's going to look something like that. Okay, so our final little thing is we have to talk a little bit about negatives. So we've only been looking at multiplying and dividing by positive values. Okay, so things actually change when I am multiplying or dividing by a negative. Okay, so we're going to do this kind of big and bold just so we make sure we have it. So when multiplying or dividing by a negative, we have to switch the sign. We have to switch the direction of our sign. Okay, so that's just kind of our big final rule. It doesn't matter up here when we're adding or subtracting, but when I'm multiplying or dividing by a negative, I have to switch the direction of my sign. So let's do a quick little example over here. So I have 2 is less than y divided by a negative 3. So I know that I'm going to be using my multiplication property because I have to multiply to get rid of that. So I multiply both sides by that negative 3 to get rid of it. Well, here, since I multiplied by that negative 3, my sign is going to change direction. Okay, so it goes from that way to that way. So what's left over here is that y. 2 times a negative 3 becomes a negative 6. Again, I can rewrite this so that I have my variable and then my symbol and then my constant. So now I have y is towards the point, so it stays towards the point, a negative 6. So I had to multiply by that negative, and so when I multiply or divide by that negative, I have to switch the direction of the sign. And this is kind of a big, huge thing that gets forgotten about, so make sure you have it highlighted and you understand exactly what you're doing here, and that it's either multiplying or dividing. It doesn't matter which one. Okay, so now that we've gone through all this, this is the extent of your 2.3 as well, is you're now going to be using these properties to solve some inequalities, but also write inequalities from graphs, and also write them from word problems and then solving them. Okay, so as always, when you get stuck and have questions, come find me and we'll work through them together.